Hey everyone, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. This show is a production of CatholicCulture.org. This is the second episode in my series on the great encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII. And this time I'm going to be discussing Libertas, on the nature of human liberty, published on June 20th, 1888. And as always, this series is a series of podcast episodes and articles going together. I'll link to the article about this encyclical in the show notes, and also you can read the encyclical Libertas itself on Catholic Culture's website, so I'll link to that as well. Now, of all the encyclicals by Pope Leo XIII that I've read so far, this one seems like the most of a sustained assault on modern assumptions, and it's about human liberty, and particularly about the nature of true liberty given by God and various false forms of liberty that have emerged in modern philosophy. And it's his attack on liberalism. So I'll be summarizing the encyclical and making some comments on it. And because so many of his points about liberalism and why it's in conflict with Catholicism are controversial even among Catholics, I'm going to read some pretty extended quotations from those sections because it's important to hear, the church in her own words, so to speak, rather than just somebody else's summary, which some people might distrust. So, all right, let's get into it. Just to give a quick outline of the topics that Leo discusses, he starts out by talking about so-called natural freedom and its purpose. Divine and human law. He talks about liberalism and its negative consequences. Then he goes into various more moderate forms of liberalism and talks about why they're still wrong. He discusses different false forms of liberty that have been invented in the modern age. He talks about some forms of liberalism, if you consider it not just as a philosophy, but as a sin or a vice. And then he discusses the question of separation of church and state towards the very end. There's a lot Leo says in this encyclical that's negative about modern ideas of liberty, but the basic positive statement of the encyclical is that freedom is a gift from God, that it's enhanced and it's assisted by grace and therefore protected by the Catholic Church, but we have to understand what this freedom rightly consists of. And towards the beginning, he says, quote, "We have on other occasions in treating of the so-called modern liberties distinguished between their good and evil elements. And we have shown that whatsoever is good in those liberties is as ancient as truth itself, and that the Church has always most willingly approved and practiced that good. But, and this is important, whatsoever has been added as new is, to tell the plain truth, of a vitiated kind, the fruit of the disorders of the age, and of an insatiate longing after novelties. Seeing, however, that many cling so obstinately to their own opinion in this matter, as to imagine these modern liberties, cankered as they are, to be the greatest glory of our age and the very basis of civil life, without which no perfect government can be conceived, we feel it a pressing duty for the sake of the common good to treat separately of this subject." So he says two things here. First of all, legitimate and good and true liberty is not new. And secondly, the idea of liberty that has been added in the modern ages is a problem. But he notes this, and this is very familiar, how people think, he says, that modern liberties are the greatest glory of our age. I mean, just think about how people just assume that anything but liberal democracy must be oppressive and slavish, and even a lot of, I would say most American conservatives, including many, many Christians and Catholics, think that the founding of America was really the first time in human history that there was any political freedom worthy of the name. And Leo says that it's just not true, that true liberty has only emerged in the modern day. Now, the encyclical focuses on what you might call moral liberty and also political liberty, but he starts by discussing natural liberty because moral liberty flows from natural liberty. So he says, "Reason sees that whatever things that are held to be good upon earth may exist or may not, and discerning that none of them are of necessity for us, it leaves the will free to choose what it pleases. But man can judge of this contingency, as we say, only because he has a soul that is simple, spiritual, and intellectual, A soul, therefore, which is not produced by matter, and does not depend on matter for its existence, but which is created immediately by God, and far surpassing the condition of things material, has a life and action of its own, so that, knowing the unchangeable and necessary reasons of what is true and good, it sees that no particular kind of good is necessary to us. So, at first he says, reason sees things that are held to be good upon earth. They may exist or may not, and therefore none of them are of necessity for us. So obviously necessity is relative to one's end. All of mankind, all creation necessarily has a final end ordained by God. And for rational beings, this is the knowledge and loving union with God. And to that final end, there are a variety of means, some of which are necessary for that end. But then there are these lesser ends that we have of a kind of a simple human flourishing, good health, education, all these things. And there are all of these means to those ends, which no one of them is necessary. So because our liberty, properly speaking, has to do with choosing means toward an end rather than the final end itself, we can't, we inherently desire the good, we inherently desire happiness, so we can't really choose not to desire the good or not to desire happiness. We can only choose means that are, more or less appropriate, and some of them are sort of indifferent. You can choose this means or that means, and it doesn't really make a difference. And that's why the will has freedom, because as rational beings, we perceive all of these things as goods or as means to goods, but because no one of them is necessary within a certain range, our will does not necessarily tend toward any one of these means to our final end. And while spiritual goods are necessary to our final end, any given material good, as Pope Leo points out, is not necessary to our final end. Now, Leo goes on, now, since everything chosen as a means is viewed as good or useful, and since good as such is the proper object of our desire, it follows that freedom of choice is a property of the will, or rather is identical with the will insofar as it has in its action the faculty of choice. But the will cannot proceed to act until it is enlightened by the knowledge possessed by the intellect. In other words, the good wished by the will is necessarily good insofar as it is known by the intellect, and this the more because in all voluntary acts, choice is subsequent to a judgment upon the truth of the good presented, declaring to which good preference should be given. No sensible man can doubt that judgment is an act of reason, not of the will. The end or object both of the rational will and of its liberty is that good only which is in conformity with reason. Now, he actually had said this same thing, more or less, in Aeterni Patris, the first encyclical I discussed on the restoration of Christian philosophy, namely this Thomistic principle that action follows upon knowledge, that the practical follows upon the speculative, that the will follows upon the apprehension and judgment of good by the intellect, which means that the choice of the will is not arbitrary. And this is going to be very important for the points he makes throughout this encyclical. The only proper end of the rational will, and therefore of the liberty of the will, is that good, he says, only which is in conformity with reason. And so here's where the topic of natural liberty comes into contact with what we would call, political liberty or sort of moral liberty. What does it really mean to be free in a moral sense? Leo says that basically that just as the possibility of taking something false for truth shows a defect in the intellect, the possibility of choosing something contrary to reason shows a defect in the will. Now, this is important because a lot of people identify freedom essentially with the possibility of choosing between good and evil, which seems very compelling at first. Of course, we can choose between good and evil because we're free. It seems obvious, right? A non-free creature doesn't have the ability to do that, and that's true. But you wouldn't say that, it's a strength of the human intellect that it is capable of falling into error. So by that analogy, it doesn't make sense to say that to be capable of sinning is a strength of the human will. In fact, it's a defect of the will. God is perfectly free, but he is incapable of choosing evil precisely because of his infinite perfection and his perfect freedom. And the angels and saints, likewise, they can't choose evil because there's no possibility of intellectual error in the beatific vision. And as he said, the will makes choices following upon the judgment of the intellect. So we can't identify freedom essentially with the possibility of choosing between good and evil. And in fact, this possibility of choosing shows an imperfection in freedom. Leo says, quote, St. Augustine and others urged most admirably against the Pelagians that if the possibility of deflection from good belonged to the essence or perfection of liberty, then God, Jesus Christ, and the angels and saints who have not this power would have no liberty at all, or would have less liberty than man has in his state of pilgrimage and imperfection. So if our essential freedom does not consist in the ability to choose between good and evil, then there's nothing particularly precious about having the freedom to choose something bad. Let's take in politics. Some people who would never choose a certain thing themselves still think that it's somehow contrary to freedom if certain things are made illegal, because it should be up to people to choose. But again, the perfection of freedom doesn't consist in your being able to choose to say something heretical, or to have an abortion, or to do drugs, or to gamble, or, solicit a prostitute or whatever. So that's just a false source of self-worth is this kind of liberty to be able to choose evil if one wanted to. Therefore, insofar as the government tolerates evil, it's going to be on other grounds, as we'll see, not on the grounds of preserving liberty per se. So Leo says that the possibility of choosing evil is why we need a law to direct us toward the good we should choose and away from the evil we should shun. Leo says, nothing more foolish can be uttered or conceived than the notion that because man is free by nature, he is therefore exempt from law. Were this the case, it would follow that to become free, we must be deprived of reason. Whereas the truth is that we are bound to submit to law precisely because we are free by our very nature. So, summarizing some points following on this, he talks about how our reason reveals the natural law to us, but the natural law only has force as law rather than just sort of the good of our own nature, because of the authority of God, who makes natural law into eternal law, which is law as such. And then he talks about human law. We also need human law when we're bound together in society. And whatever human laws reiterate the natural law also have the force of eternal law. But human law, properly speaking, he says, is law which follows only indirectly from the natural law. And so it's not simply reiterating the natural law, but it gives specific instantiation to principles that are more general. Quote, for instance, though nature commands all to contribute to the public peace and prosperity, whatever belongs to the manner and circumstances and conditions under which such service is to be rendered must be determined by the wisdom of men and not by nature herself. So lawmakers, human lawmakers, are not limited to just reiterating the natural law. They also make laws that are kind of contingent according to circumstances for what's best for the common good based on the natural law, but not absolutely necessitated by it. And this is where prudence comes into play. But it's still true law because it's based on the natural law and not contrary to it. So Leo says, the true liberty of human society does not consist in every man doing what he pleases, for this would simply end in turmoil and confusion and bring on the overthrow of the state, but rather in this, that through the injunctions of the civil law, all may more easily conform to the prescriptions of the eternal law. Likewise, the liberty of those who are in authority does not consist in the power to lay unreasonable and capricious commands upon their subjects, which would equally be criminal and would lead to the ruin of the commonwealth, but the binding force of human laws is in this, that they are to be regarded as applications of the eternal law, and incapable of sanctioning anything which is not contained in the eternal law, as in the principle of all law. And he also points out, a principle that's very familiar to us Catholics, that when authority decrees something contrary to reason, it thereby has no binding force of law. But now we get to false liberty. So here's how he introduces the topic of liberalism. Quote, But many there are who follow in the footsteps of Lucifer, and adopt as their own his rebellious cry, I will not serve, and consequently substitute for true liberty what is sheer and most foolish license. Such, for instance, are the men belonging to that widely spread and powerful organization who, usurping the name of liberty, style themselves liberals. Okay, so this is a 19th century encyclical. He's not talking about the Democratic Party starting in the 60s and 70s or something like that. Obviously, they'd be included, but he's talking about something much wider. And we may all be caught in the condemnations of Leo if we are too caught up in modern assumptions, whether we are conservatives or liberals in the contemporary senses of those words. So he's talking about the original kind of Enlightenment classical liberalism. And in this section, it's particularly important for me to just quote from him. All right. So he says, first of all, defining liberalism. What naturalists or rationalists aim at in philosophy, that the supporters of liberalism, carrying out the principles laid down by naturalism, are attempting in the domain of morality and politics. The fundamental doctrine of rationalism is the supremacy of the human reason, which, refusing due submission to the divine and eternal reason, proclaims its own independence, and constitutes itself the supreme principle and source and judge of truth. Hence, these followers of liberalism deny the existence of any divine authority to which obedience is due, and proclaim that every man is the law to himself, from which arises that ethical system which they style independent morality, and which, under the guise of liberty, exonerates man from any obedience to the commands of God and substitutes a boundless license. So this is very important, that this idea of the absolute freedom of human liberty comes directly from this idea of the autonomy of the human intellect, which is rationalism. So he had earlier said that the will follows the judgment of the intellect. So here, when he relates liberalism to rationalism, he's essentially saying that liberalism is to the will as rationalism is to the intellect. And if the intellect's not under divine teaching, then neither will the will be under divine authority. So continuing to quote Leo, the end of all this, it is not difficult to foresee, especially when society is in question. For when once man is firmly persuaded that he is subject to no one, it follows that the efficient cause of the unity of civil society is not to be sought in any principle external to man, or superior to him, but simply in the free will of individuals. That the authority in the state comes from the people only, and that, just as every man's individual reason is his only rule of life, so the collective reason of the community should be the supremacy of the greater number, and that all right and duty reside in the majority. So immediate political, civil consequences, various errors that follow from liberalism. The idea that the consent of the governed is the sole source of the authority of the state. Now, as has been discussed on this podcast before, well, quite a while ago, really, is that in the Western tradition, there's been this idea, certainly in the Catholic tradition, that authority can be selected on which person the authority is bestowed by the consent of the governed. I mean, after all, the Pope is elected, right? So there are democratic procedures that exist within the Catholic Church, within monastic foundations in the Middle Ages and so on. But any true authority ultimately comes from God, and the consent of the governed is what in part might decide who gets that authority, but it's not the source of the authority. And that authority can't simply be withdrawn by the consent of the governed as easily as it was bestowed by the consent of the governed. Another error following from liberalism that he identifies is the kind of the worship of majority rule, the idea that democracy is just an end in itself. Now, I actually don't know if democracy being an end in itself, the majority rule thing, is a necessary consequence of liberalism. One might just, go for anarchy or something instead, but he's talking about the historical consequences that have actually happened at this time that he's writing from liberalism. So to keep quoting him, but from what has been said, it is clear that all this is in contradiction to reason. To refuse any bond of union between man and civil society on the one hand, and God the Creator, and consequently the supreme lawgiver on the other, is plainly repugnant to the nature not only of man, but of all created things. For of necessity, all effects must in some proper way be connected with their cause, and it belongs to the perfection of every nature to contain itself within that sphere and grade which the order of nature has assigned to it, namely, that the lower should be subject and obedient to the higher. So, just here we've got some nice Thomistic philosophy about cause and effect and efficient causes and things like that. But basically, God is the cause of society, so it makes no sense to say that, God as lawgiver has no connection with society. Continuing on, he says, moreover, besides this, a doctrine of such character is most hurtful both to individuals and to the state. For once ascribed to human reason the only authority to decide what is true and what is good, and the real distinction between good and evil is destroyed. Honor and dishonor differ not in their nature, but in the opinion and judgment of each one. Pleasure is the measure of what is lawful, and given a code of morality which can have little or no power to restrain or quiet the unruly propensities of man, a way is naturally open to universal corruption. So he points out that rationalism leads to liberalism, and liberalism and rationalism lead to relativism. Who decides? If it's all based on our reason, there's no external law, either of reason or will that we have to follow, then we open the door to relativism. And there's a further consequence of this. Ironically, with reference also to public affairs, authority is severed from the true and natural principle whence it derives all its efficacy for the common good, and the law determining what it is right to do and avoid doing is at the mercy of a majority. Now, this is simply a road leading straight to tyranny. So you go right from relativism to that phrase used by Pope Benedict XVI, famously, the dictatorship of relativism. And when the state or lawgivers, when they deny the authority of God over them, they deny the source of their own authority. And so all they have, as far as their mindset is concerned, is this arbitrary power over others. And because they don't recognize themselves as accountable to a higher law, to a higher authority, they act like tyrants. Another social consequence he lays out, and this is all just such great and perceptive stuff. Quote, the empire of God over man and civil society once repudiated, it follows that religion as a public institution can have no claim to exist, and that everything that belongs to religion will be treated with complete indifference. So, rationalism, liberalism, relativism, the dictatorship of relativism, all lead to religion being treated essentially as a private club, which we obviously see today. It's being driven out of the public square, already has been, really. And a further social consequence of liberalism that he discusses is that because, law has lost its force, it's become just a dictatorship of relativism and all this stuff, there'll be much more social upheaval and sedition among the people. There'll be a lack of a sense of duty and conscience coming from properly used authority. And because of this, he says, there will be nothing to hold them back but force, which of itself alone is powerless to keep their covetousness in check. Of this we have almost daily evidence in the conflict with socialists and members of other seditious societies who labor unceasingly to bring about revolution. It is for those, then, who are capable of forming a just estimate of things to decide whether such doctrines promote that true liberty which alone is worthy of man, or rather pervert and destroy it. So here he says, again, very important, socialism is a result of liberalism in the classical Enlightenment sense of that word. Socialism, communism, liberalism, these are all basically revolutionary philosophies that deny the true basis of authority in God and in the true religion, the Catholic Church, and therefore they open themselves to self-destruction, to other people deciding that their authority has no basis, and therefore there's this constant tumult, constant revolution. They've cut off the ground beneath their feet. So he's described the liberalism, properly speaking, this absolute denial of divine reason, divine law over man, this complete autonomy of the individual. And then he goes on, because of course some people are going to try to find a way to be liberal in some form, without being that radical. He discusses various forms of liberalism as a philosophy. Some of these more moderate forms are erroneous, as we'll see, but they might appear to be better because they're not as openly opposed to the truth as the liberalism in its sort of purest, most revolutionary form. So there's two basic groups he discusses. So first he describes, very many amongst them, compelled by the force of truth, do not hesitate to admit that such liberty, the pure form of liberalism he already described, is vicious, nay, is simple license, whenever intemperate in its claims to the neglect of truth and justice, and therefore they would have liberty ruled and directed by right reason, and consequently subject to the natural law and to the divine eternal law. But here they think they may stop, holding that man as a free being is bound by no law of God, except such as he makes known to us through our natural reason. So they will admit the natural law. They'll even admit the natural law comes from God, and so is divine and eternal law. But they don't think men and societies are bound by revelation. And I think this describes some of America's founding fathers pretty well. You know, they were, some of them, deists, of course, and they thought that God, created nature, and therefore the rules of nature are God's rules, but they thought of revelation as something kind of extraneous to that. So Leo critiques them. In this, they are plainly inconsistent, for if the will of the divine lawgiver is to be obeyed, because every man is under the power of God and tends toward him as his end, it follows that no one can assign limits to his legislative authority without failing in the obedience which is due. Indeed, if the human mind be so presumptuous as to define the nature and extent of God's rights and its own duties, reverence for the divine law will be apparent rather than real, and arbitrary judgment will prevail over the authority and providence of God. This reminds me of a point made by the Catholic philosopher D.C. Schindler, and I've interviewed him twice in our first interview, which was about his excellent book, The Politics of the Real. He talks about, in that episode and the book, how there's this kind of false humility on the part of liberalism and from men and from states, this idea that the state, religion isn't within the purview of the state. The state isn't qualified to assent to religious truth. But that's false humility, because the state, no authority can define its own boundaries. The boundaries of any given authority, of any given subject, are defined obviously by the higher authority over that lesser authority. So we can't actually define our own purview, whether that be narrower than it actually is or wider than it actually is, without usurping God's authority over us. So he goes on to say that man is bound by revelation. Quote, "Man must therefore take his standard of a loyal and religious life from the eternal law, and from all and every one of those laws which God, in his infinite wisdom and power, has been pleased to enact, and to make known to us by such clear and unmistakable signs as to leave no room for doubt. And the more so because laws of this kind have the same origin, the same author as the eternal law, are absolutely in accordance with right reason, and perfect the natural law. These laws it is that embody the government of God, who graciously guides and directs the intellect and the will of man, lest these fall into error. Let then that continue to remain in a holy and inviolable union, which neither can nor should be separated. And in all things, for this is the dictate of right reason itself, let God be dutifully and obediently served." And I just want to point out something which I noticed throughout this encyclical is when he's talking about our obligation to follow the divine law, even laws and truths that we only know by revelation, those can't be separated from the eternal, natural law, so to speak, because they come from the same source. They're equally infallible, and the revealed truths perfect the natural law. But also, when he talks about this obligation of man to follow revelation and revealed law, divine positive law, and such, at no point does Leo make a distinction between man as a private individual and man as the state, because the state is a human institution, it's human activity, and what is an obligation of man as man is an obligation of man acting in society. So he's not going to allow for the idea that the state should only be concerned with the natural law and not with divine revelation. As we'll see in this encyclical and also in his encyclical, which had already been published before this, but we'll discuss later, Immortale Dei. So to sum up, the first group of more moderate liberals, which he discusses, are the ones who acknowledge natural and divine law insofar as they can be discovered by reason, but they don't acknowledge revelation. And following on the point I just made about how he doesn't distinguish between man and the state when it comes to fundamental human obligations, here's the second group of liberals, and these are very, very common even among conservative Catholics, and so this is very important. Leo says, there are others, somewhat more moderate, though not more consistent, who affirm that the morality of individuals is to be guided by the divine law, but not the morality of the state, for that in public affairs the commands of God may be passed over and may be entirely disregarded in the framing of laws. Hence follows the fatal theory of the need of separation between church and state. I'll say that again. Hence follows the fatal theory of the need of separation between church and state. He goes right into criticizing it. But the absurdity of such a position is manifest. Nature herself proclaims the necessity of the state providing means and opportunities whereby the community may be enabled to live properly, that is to say, according to the laws of God. For since God is the source of all goodness and justice, it is absolutely ridiculous that the state should pay no attention to these laws or render them abortive by contrary enactments. Besides, those who are in authority owe it to the commonwealth not only to provide for its external well-being and the conveniences of life, but still more to consult the welfare of men's souls in the wisdom of their legislation. The state is not only concerned with our material well-being, it is concerned with the welfare of men's souls, even more so. But for the increase of such benefits, nothing more suitable can be conceived than the laws which have God for their author, and therefore they who in their government of the state take no account of these laws abuse political power by causing it to deviate from its proper end and from what nature itself prescribes. And he mentions a kind of a practical point, which is very interesting. And what is still more important, what we have more than once pointed out, although the civil authority has not the same proximate end as the spiritual, nor proceeds on the same lines, nevertheless, in the exercise of their separate powers, they must occasionally meet, for their subjects are the same, namely human beings, their subjects are the same, and not infrequently they deal with the same objects, though in different ways. Whenever this occurs, since a state of conflict is absurd and manifestly repugnant to the most wise ordinance of God, there must necessarily exist some order or mode of procedure to remove the occasions of difference and contention, and to secure harmony in all things. This harmony has been not inaptly compared to that which exists between the body and the soul for the well-being of both one and the other, the separation of which brings irremediable harm to the body, since it extinguishes its very life. So when he talks about these areas where the separate ends of the spiritual and the temporal authorities, the state, intersect, you could think of topics like marriage and education. These are both things that Leo and the popes after him are particularly concerned with in terms of the liberty of the church, for instance. So obviously the state has a very important social, temporal interest in the goods of marriage, and obviously the church regulates marriage. And so if the state, for instance, is presuming to decide on its own what constitutes marriage, what constitutes a valid marriage, who can marry whom, and things like that, without reference to the law of the church, there's going to be problems. If the state presumes to separate what God has joined, to annul or divorce couples that the church won't allow to be annulled or divorced, there's a problem. Likewise, when the state conducts education without regard to the freedom of the church for religious education or, the importance of religion in civil society. If you don't want there to be conflict, obviously the alternative to solve that is harmony. And it's not just any harmony. It's not two equal partners, because the spiritual authority is should be obvious to Catholics anyway, superior to the temporal authority. And therefore, he compares it to the harmony between the body and the soul. And he notes the separation of which brings irremediable harm to the body. The church, if the state rejects the church, that in a sense might harm souls, but it doesn't harm the church per se. I mean, the church will outlive the state, any given state. And so it's really the state hurting itself most of all if the state rejects the authority of the church. So again, that second group of more moderate liberals are the ones who acknowledge natural law, eternal law, and even divine revelation, but only for individuals and private groups, not for the state. And this describes the majority of modern Catholics after Vatican II, I would guess. But of course, Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Liberty it specifically said that it left the traditional church teaching on the obligations of men and societies towards the true religion intact. It just didn't explicitly reiterate them, as we'll get to when we discuss the encyclical on church and state, Immortale Dei, which has some of these same points. Okay, so now we're going to get into a few false kinds of liberty that Leo is going to critique and condemn. They are the liberty of worship, the liberty of speech and the press, liberty of teaching, liberty of conscience, and then he talks about various forms of tolerance. So first, liberty of worship, which he defines as the belief that every man is free to profess as he may choose any religion or none. He says that the chief duty of man is to worship God, and therefore, quote, no true virtue can exist without religion. The reason for that is because all virtues are ordered to this highest virtue of religion. Now, which religion, you might ask? Leo has an obvious answer, and I quote, that one which God enjoins and which man can easily recognize by certain exterior notes, whereby divine providence has willed that it should be distinguished, because in a matter of such moment, the most terrible loss would be the consequence of error. So he says, liberty to choose any religion or none is no liberty, but its degradation and the abject submission of the soul to sin. So this is the traditional teaching of the church. Error, as such, has no rights. And if you read the Vatican II Declaration on Religious Liberty carefully, it does not base its idea of religious liberty on the idea that man has the right per se to, worship a false god or something like that. It has other considerations in mind. So Leo goes on about liberty of worship. This kind of liberty, if considered in relation to the state, clearly implies that there is no reason why the state should offer any homage to God or should desire any public recognition of him, that no one form of worship is to be preferred to another, but that all stand on an equal footing, no account being taken of the religion of the people, even if they profess the Catholic faith. But to justify this, it must needs be taken as true that the state has no duty towards God, or that such duties, if they exist, can be abandoned with impunity, both of which assertions are manifestly false. And the reason for this is because it was God who made man for society, and God is the founder of the social order. So therefore, the social order and its authority has obligations towards God and the religion established by God. Quote, wherefore civil society must acknowledge God as its founder and parent, and must obey and reverence his power and authority. Justice therefore forbids, and reason itself forbids, the state to be godless. Now we probably all agree with that. And he goes on to say something more controversial again for a lot of modern, unwittingly, classically liberal Catholics. Or to adopt a line of action, this is forbidden, justice forbids and reason itself forbids, to adopt a line of action which would end in godlessness, namely to treat the various religions, as they call them, alike, and to bestow upon them promiscuously equal rights and privileges. And he goes on to say the state should preserve and protect one religion, specifically the true religion. So there you have it. Leo condemns as an error the idea that the state should not offer homage to God or publicly recognize him or prefer any one form of worship to another. And he says that not only does reason and justice forbid the state to be godless, but also there's a line of action which leads to godlessness, which is religious indifferentism. And religious indifferentism of the state is religious indifferentism, full stop. It's no less religious indifferentism when the state behaves as though they're all equal and no one is more true than another, as if an individual were to treat that way. Because again, the state is a human institution. It's men acting. Second false form of liberty, liberty of speech and the press. All right, buckle up. Leo says, "It is hardly necessary to say that there can be no such right as this if it be not used in moderation, and if it pass beyond the bounds and end of all true liberty." Okay, so this one, he allows for some moderate form of liberty of speech in the press, as is right and just. For right is a moral power which, as we have before said, and must again and again repeat, it is absurd to suppose that nature has accorded indifferently to truth and falsehood, to justice and injustice. Men have a right freely and prudently to propagate throughout the state what things soever are true and honorable, so that as many as possible may possess them. But lying opinions, than which no mental plague is greater, and vices which corrupt the heart and moral life, should be diligently repressed by public authority, lest they insidiously work the ruin of the state. I mean, you see this with the contemporary debate over whether flag burning is protected by our constitutional rights. I mean, it's just absurd to think that a law should be interpreted in such a way as destroys the very basis of the law, which would be respect for the state, respect for the properly constituted authority, and the nation itself, which the flag symbolizes. So it's just out of the question that freedom of speech could include the freedom to undermine the very basis of freedom itself, rightly understood. Then he makes a really great point about what you might call intellectual oppression of the weak by the strong. And this is just so true when you look at academia, at the media, and the way that they, elites push these perverted opinions on people who are less intelligent and more easily propagandized. Leo says, "The excesses of an unbridled intellect, which unfailingly end in the oppression of the untutored multitude, are no less rightly controlled by the authority of the law than are the injuries inflicted by violence upon the weak. And this all the more surely because by far the greater part of the community is either absolutely unable or able only with great difficulty to escape from illusions and deceitful subtleties, especially such as flatter the passions." So, look, we talk a lot, very common in libertarian conservative circles, to talk about, oh, well, we'll just settle this in the marketplace of ideas. Leo does not consider the realm of ideas to be a mere marketplace. When there is absolute freedom of speech and thought, the marketplace of ideas becomes a kind of battleground, you might say, on which the intellectually strong control or destroy the weak. And this is a genuine, this scandal, on the weaker brethren, so to speak, is a genuine form of oppression that needs to be curbed by the state. And this is why, we shouldn't just allow, heresies to spread like wild and let people decide for themselves, because most people can discover the truth on their own only with great difficulty. Another negative consequence of unbridled freedom of speech: if unbridled license of speech and of writing be granted to all, nothing will remain sacred and inviolate. Even the highest and truest mandates of nature, justly held to be the common and noblest heritage of the human race, will not be spared. Thus, truth being gradually obscured by darkness, pernicious and manifold error, as too often happens, will easily prevail. Thus, too, license will gain what liberty loses, for liberty will ever be more free and secure as in proportion as license is kept in fuller restraint. So a couple points here. First of all, what I mentioned earlier, I think the flag, it's a symbolic example, but I still think it's a good example, which is basically that a nation that holds that the most sacred of our liberties is to be able to burn the flag is a nation which officially holds that there is nothing sacred, basically. And the other point I think worth noting here, again, that as license increases, liberty decreases, and as license decreases, liberty increases. But then he qualifies this condemnation of absolute freedom of speech by saying, "In regard, however, to all matter of opinion, which God leaves to man's free discussion, full liberty of thought and of speech is naturally within the right of everyone, for such liberty never leads men to suppress the truth, but often to discover it and make it known. And a little bit later, he says something like this: "We must not forget that a vast field lies freely open to man's industry and genius, containing all those things which have no necessary connection with Christian faith and morals, or as to which the Church, exercising no authority, leaves the judgment of the learned free and unconstrained." So, Pope Leo is not saying that the government should make it illegal to, be wrong about geology or something like that. He's talking about areas where speech would sort of directly harm the common good or Christian faith and morals. And then I'll move through the next three just as bullet points, because they kind of follow obviously from the points that he's already made about liberty of worship and liberty of speech. So the third kind of false liberty of teaching, basically just a particular kind of speech. And he talks about the importance of the liberty of the church to teach mankind. And, one point that he does make in this encyclical is that insofar as this false liberty of teaching proliferates, usually the church's liberty to teach becomes restricted, which we obviously see today. Fourth, liberty of conscience. And the only point I'll make here is Leo points out that the only legitimate meaning of liberty of conscience is when we have to obey God as against unjust human commands and laws. So as a kind of corollary to the discussion of liberty, there is the idea of tolerance. So I'll quote him again here. "While not conceding any right to anything save what is true and honest, the Church does not forbid public authority to tolerate." See, tolerance is different from a right. "The Church does not forbid public authority to tolerate what is at variance with truth and justice for the sake of avoiding some greater evil, or of obtaining or preserving some greater good. God himself in his providence, though infinitely good and powerful, permits evil to exist in the world, partly that greater good may not be impeded, and partly that greater evil may not ensue. In the government of states, it is not forbidden to imitate the ruler of the world, and as the authority of man is powerless to prevent every evil, it has, as St. Augustine says, to overlook and leave unpunished many things which are punished, and rightly, by divine providence." Example, St. Thomas Aquinas famously argued that prostitution should be legal. Now, we don't have to agree with him on that, but that's an example how Catholic theologians have acknowledged the principle that not all evils must be forbidden by the state, not because anybody has a right to prostitution, but simply because some greater evil might be prevented by making it illegal or something like that. Now, obviously, I don't actually think prostitution should be legal, for the record. But so Leo goes on to qualify this. "But if in such circumstances, for the sake of common good, and this is the only legitimate reason, human law may or even should tolerate evil, it may not and should not approve or desire evil for its own sake. For evil of itself, being a privation of good, is opposed to the common welfare which every legislator is bound to desire and defend to the best of his ability. In this, human law must endeavor to imitate God, who, as St. Thomas teaches, in allowing evil to exist in the world, neither wills evil to be done, nor wills it not to be done, but wills only to permit it to be done, and this is good. This saying of the angelic doctor contains briefly the whole doctrine of the permission of evil." But he goes on to say, again, this tolerance is not really a good in itself. It's undesirable, actually. Quote, "The more a state is driven to tolerate evil, the further it is from perfection." And he says the tolerance of evil, which is dictated by political prudence, should be strictly confined to the limits which its justifying cause, the public welfare, requires. He continues to say that the church acquiesces in certain modern liberties out of expedience, but not as an ideal. And he makes a point of clarifying that, lest we think that error and truth have equal rights, which is not true. And that's one of the dangers of tolerance, even when legitimate, is that it gives the impression that error and truth are on equal grounds. So there's a nice paragraph where he summarizes his doctrine on true and false liberty. "Man, by a necessity of his nature, is wholly subject to the most faithful and ever-enduring power of God, and as a consequence, any liberty, except that which consists in submission to God and in subjection to his will, is unintelligible. To deny the existence of this authority in God, or to refuse to submit to it, means to act not as a free man, but as one who treasonably abuses his liberty. And in such a disposition of mind, the chief and deadly vice of liberalism essentially consists." I want to read one line again. Any liberty, except that which consists in submission to God and in subjection to his will, is unintelligible. Very important to keep that in mind in politics. So a bit of sort of recapitulation. He had talked about forms of, various forms of liberalism, and now he talks again about liberalism specifically as a sin or a vice. So the fullest and worst form of this vice is rejecting the authority of God and refusing obedience to him in public or private affairs. And then the second, more moderate, but still bad form is admitting we have duties toward God, but rejecting all the laws of faith and morals that are above natural reason, or at least denying that these should be respected publicly by the state, which again, sort of like deism, the American system. And again, he repeats something similar to what he had said earlier. He said, quote, "From this teaching, as from its source and principle, flows that fatal principle of the separation of church and state." And he talks about different ideas, ways of understanding separation of church and state. Again, there's a more extreme form and a more moderate form, both of which are wrong. The first form is complete separation so that the church may as well not exist insofar as the state is concerned, and at most the state will allow citizens to practice their faith privately. And then I'll summarize this. I'll give his quote on the second form. "Others oppose not the existence of the church, nor indeed could they, yet they despoil her of the nature and rights of a perfect society, and maintain that it does not belong to her to legislate, to judge, or to punish, but only to exhort, to advise, and to rule her subjects in accordance with their own consent and will. By such opinion, they pervert the nature of this divine society, and attenuate and narrow its authority, its office of teacher, and its whole efficiency, and at the same time they aggrandize the power of the civil government to such extent as to subject the Church of God to the empire and sway of the state, like any voluntary association of citizens." And again, on this point, I want to reference D.C. Schindler's excellent book, The Politics of the Real. So this is Leo reiterating the teaching of the church that the church indeed has the rights to coerce the baptized in matters of religion. The church is not simply a voluntary society that you can enter and leave freely. Well, certainly entry into the church has to be a free act, but once you've become Catholic, once you're baptized, you are under the authority of the church and you can't stop being under that authority. But quite obviously, the secular state, such as we have now, does not recognize that reality, and therefore it at the very least implicitly and really explicitly contradicts the rights of the church to be a perfect society. That's actually a technical term that I don't have the space or bandwidth to go into in this episode, unfortunately, but you can look up what that means, perfect society. I'll wrap this up in a second here, but also worth mentioning a couple of points he makes about a legitimate kind of freedom in selecting forms of government. And this is important because there were some kind of reactionary Catholics in the past couple centuries before Leo who were absolutely opposed to new forms of government, new regimes, democracy, etc. And, Leo makes a point of saying that different types of regimes are potentially acceptable. So what does Leo think of the idea that the church should adapt and cooperate with modern forms of government? He says this is actually a legitimate opinion, insofar as it doesn't involve practices and beliefs that are the result of perverted morals and ideology. Another point he makes, if the people are being oppressed or the church is being deprived of liberty, it is lawful to seek a change of government. And this could include a move to democracy as long as the Catholic doctrine on, quote, the origin and exercise of power is maintained. What I was talking about above, that, authority doesn't ultimately come only from the consent of the governed. And likewise, Pope Leo says that the church does not condemn movements to gain national independence from foreign powers, as long as those movements don't violate justice. So, just to wrap up, I'll give one more quote from Leo, which gives kind of a practical summary of what's been said. "From what has been said, it follows that it is quite unlawful to demand, to defend, or to grant unconditional freedom of thought, of speech, of writing, or of worship, as if these were so many rights given by nature to man. For if nature had really granted them, it would be lawful to refuse obedience to God, and there would be no restraint on human liberty. It likewise follows that freedom in these things may be tolerated wherever there is just cause, but only with such moderation as will prevent its degenerating into license and excess. And where such liberties are in use, men should employ them in doing good, and should estimate them as the Church does, for liberty is to be regarded as legitimate insofar only as it affords greater facility for doing good, but no farther. Essentially, don't treat liberty as an end in itself. All right, well, I think this is a very, very enlightening encyclical, and I'm happy to have discussed it as the second installment in this series because it really provides a broad theoretical basis for things that we're going to discuss when it comes to, all sorts of other topics that Leo's going to cover, whether that be socialism, church and state, the family, things like that. I mean, this encyclical is a perfect example of why I wanted to do this series, because we can't just be quoting only Rerum Novarum and ignoring all these other amazing teachings from Pope Leo that are so essential to understand the world we live in and what's gone wrong with it and what we can do to make it right. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking with me, for listening to this. Again, I'll link to the encyclical Libertas in the comments and to my article summarizing some of these points. I hope you enjoyed this. Please give me any feedback you wish. I'm not that experienced doing solo episodes, so in part this series is kind of a way for me to get better at doing that. So let me know if you have any constructive criticism about my delivery. And thanks, everybody. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.